1756. I'm gonna let y'all listen to some more, and then let's go to Revelation, the 13th chapter, and hold that. We're gonna start at the top. 17, what did I say, 17? Let's see if I can snatch some more up out of it. All this is good. All this is good.
So, Colonel, for most people, you probably do not need an introduction, but for those who are not aware, we're a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, author of several grants now falling apart or being destroyed.
Let me see here. I'm gonna just let y'all hear some of this right here too. All of it's good, man, but I'm gonna let y'all hear this.
Between Moscow and Kiev, or us, until it is over to the satisfaction of the Russians. So I think he sent a very clear and very important signal. I'm not sure he intended to do that, but he did.
My fault.
And I think he's also trying to position himself as saying that they have done all that we can reasonably expect them to do.
Talking about Ukraine.
Secondly, it's time to negotiate. This is a good time before the offensive that I have been describing begins. Because I think he knows that once that begins, that there will be no further discussion under any circumstances between Moscow and Kiev or us until it is over to the satisfaction of the Russians. So I think he sent a very clear and very important signal. I'm not sure he intended to do that, but he did. And I think he's also trying to position himself as saying in the future, well, I warned them that they should negotiate. I warned the president that this would happen. This is his behavior pattern. But I think he has inadvertently revealed the truth. And that truth is precisely energy, fuel,
Oh, my fault.
transportation.
My fault. I gotta go back and play it from the part to where they can understand what he's talking about. Because I kind of like messed that up.
Before they're freezing. He knows the serious weakness that characterized Ukrainian forces. So he is saying they have done all that we can reasonably expect them to do. Secondly, it's time to negotiate. This is a good time before the offensive that I have been describing begins. Because I think he knows that once that begins, that there will be no further discussion under any circumstances between Moscow and Kiev or us until it is over to the satisfaction of the Russians. So I think he sent a very clear and very important signal. I'm not sure he intended to do that, but he did. And I think he's also trying to position himself as saying in the future, well, I warned them that they should negotiate. I warned the president that this would happen. This is his behavior pattern. But I think he has inadvertently revealed the truth. And that truth is that this is a good time for the Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table. They're not going to get what they would have gotten 2 months ago. But we should really end this war, because the longer this lasts, the higher the probability that we may end up in a direct confrontation with the Russians.
No, I agree. And well, I was curious because you mentioned now that the Ukrainians seems to be exhausted. Not just their military, their military equipment, but also with the economy and also the electric grids now falling apart or being destroyed. But in terms of its Western sponsors, though, in the context of this being a proxy war, what's the endurance in the West? How long do you see Europe being able to continue along this path? Is the Ukraine fatigue? Do you expect it to set in? And also the United States. Do you see any changes, especially now after the midterm elections? Will the outcome have any impact at all in terms of scaling back, or is this Western unity over this issue and bipartisan consensus within the United States?
Well, let's look first at Europe. And most important in Europe is Germany. Germany is the powerhouse. Germany is the preeminent power, regional power in Europe. and Germany's economy is expected to contract 20 to 30% as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed and the lack of access to natural gas and oil from Russia. That's a disaster. You're talking about practically the deindustrialization of Germany. Now, for Europeans that don't like Germany, that may seem like a good thing. It's not, because Germany really boosts the economies of the rest of the continent. And if Germany goes down that path, and I think that's where they're headed right now, it's going to be very bad for Europe at large. Now, the Italians have already said they don't want to send any more aid unless it's humanitarian. The latest polls that I saw over the weekend suggest that roughly 40% of the German electorate has now finally reached the conclusion that their government and media are not telling them the truth. They're beginning to see that what the Russians have said and what the Russians are doing is different from what they've been told. I think that is the beginning of the end of the current coalition in Berlin. In addition to that, I think there are others in Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands and France who are beginning to question. That's certainly the case in Austria, even though Austria is not in NATO. I said from the very beginning that I thought that if this lasted for more than 6 months, it might very well destroy NATO. Because let's be frank, the national interests of people that live in Sweden or Finland are not the same as the national interests of the people that live in Spain and Italy. All alliances are difficult to hold together in war. Trying to hold a real military alliance together in what has been peacetime is enormously difficult. And the principal reason for the last decades or so has been that, well, this is another way to reach Washington, the NATO system. This is another way to acquire money and support, influence, and so forth. Remember, every small power has an interest in exploiting the larger power in pursuit of its own interests. We have multiple small powers doing that sort of thing. But I think what has really been exposed more than anything else is that Europe consists of a large number of military dependencies. They're not independent, sovereign states. I was on the phone recently with some French colleagues because I'm sure most of your viewers know that I served at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and I spent many years serving in U.S. forces in Germany before I went to Mons. And I know a lot of senior officers who are now retired that I served with back in 1997, 98, 99, and 2000. And they've been very blunt. They've said, you know, Doug, the French army has 4 days of ammunition. The French army is prepared to go on safari in North Africa, and that's it. The German army is almost non-existent. So where is this great coalition of the willing coming from that was discussed recently in the media in the United States? A multinational task force that could conceivably enter Ukraine based upon what General Retired Petraeus said. Well, it consists of perhaps 40, 50,000 U.S. troops, 30,000 Polish troops, 20,000 Romanians. And this multinational force would at some point potentially stagger into Western Ukraine. When and how and under what circumstances, I have no idea, but the idea is absurd. The Russians are firing 20,000 rounds of artillery every day. The Ukrainians have been firing 7,000 trying to keep up. This is something Europe has not seen, and by the way, neither has the United States in a very long time. It's called a real war against a real enemy, an organized force. NATO was designed to defend, not to wage offensive warfare. We, since the 1990s, have been trying to turn NATO into an offensive instrument. We tried to use it that way in the Balkans, and were somewhat successful in our conduct of those operations, though I think the outcome is a very questionable long-term strategic viability, as we're finding out. But we've also tried to drag Europe with us into the Middle East, into Libya, into North Africa, We have tried to drag the Europeans in to augment us virtually everywhere we have decided to use military power. Russia is the latest example. And more Europeans are beginning to say, is this really what we want to do? As I said, I think on some program recently, that when I was talking to a European, I think they were Swiss, I said, where are all of these anxious Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, German volunteers ready to suit up and march east to the Eastern Front and fight the Russians? I said, if they're out there, I haven't seen them. And I don't see much stomach for it in Europe. And by the way, I'm not advocating that. I think the whole idea is very stupid because I never saw Russia today through the lens that is Soviet. This is not the Soviet Union. This is a very different Russia, and it is also much more limited in its capabilities, as people have pointed out. Now, in the United States, you have a somewhat different picture. The two parties have disappointed Americans for a very long time simply because they have become so much alike. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we can expect very much to change in the near term. Americans are not different from European.
I just wanted y'all to hear that part. You know what I'm saying? It's some more on it, but what I want to get, because we got to get back to these scriptures, what I want to get is Revelation 13 to start at the top.
All right, this is Revelation chapter 13, verse 1.
Go ahead.
And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast raised up out of the sea,
Go ahead.
having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horn 10 crowns,
Go ahead.
and upon his heads the name of blasphemy.
7 heads and 10 horns. 10 horns is the EU. The 7 heads is basically like combined together with NATO, okay? Because you got NATO members, part of the EU, but the 10 horns are the EU, okay? You got, that's NATO and the EU, okay? 7 heads combined, that's part of NATO. So, like again, the 10 horns are the EU, okay? Go ahead.
So verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard.
Okay, the beast that I saw is like unto a leopard. Now, that leopard goes back to Alexander. Okay, go ahead.
And his feet were as the feet of a bear.
Now, when you look at the bear, that goes into Russia. And the feet is the end of something. So Russia is going to be the end of this beast, which is NATO and the EU. Okay? And you heard that colonel say in war, it's hard for militaries to stick together. And you see the condition of Germany, how he was explaining how Germany is being weakened. Now, Germany is part of the EU, okay? And when you read Revelation chapter 17, it said that 10 horns shall hate the whore and make her desolate. Okay, that's in Revelation chapter 17, and the whore is America. Okay, so Germany is part of the EU, man, and Germany in a predicament. Spain is part of the EU. Okay, they gonna turn on America, man. Okay, these nations are going to turn on America, man, and destroy this place, man. Okay, go ahead.
It says, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion.
Now, the mouth of a lion, that's going into Great Britain, okay? Because if you Google image concerning the lion in Great Britain, it will pop up. That's how we know that it's talking about Great Britain, okay? Now, start from the top and read that for me again.
All right. This is Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy.
See, the name of blasphemy. Go ahead.
Verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard.
Okay, that leopard is talking about Alexander. Okay, because when you read in the Old Testament, Alexander was known as a leopard. reason why he's known as that leopard is because he took down the dark nations at that time when he was coming to power in great speed. Go ahead.
And his feet were as the feet of a bear.
The feet of a bear is talking about the Russian bear, man. And the feet is the end of something. Okay? So the bear is gonna end America, man. NATO and the EU, man. All that's gonna be busted up, man. Okay? And America is the head of NATO. America got the biggest military in NATO. And Turkey got the second biggest military, but Russia is the chief prince over Turkey, man. When you read Ezekiel 38. So Turkey is part of NATO, but Turkey gonna turn on America, man. Go ahead.
And his mouth as the mouth of a lion.
That lion is Great Britain, man. Go ahead. And Great Britain gonna shoot missiles on America, man. Okay? Great Britain is deeply embedded in Ukraine war, man. Okay? They gonna turn on America too. They gonna shoot missiles on America. Go ahead.
And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and a great authority.
They gave him his seat. Where's the seat? America, man. The seat is America, man. Okay, go ahead.
And great authority. It says verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death.
So that's going into how it's jumping time periods. That's going into how the old Roman Empire failed. Okay, go ahead.
And his deadly wound was healed.
His deadly wound was healed. How did the old Roman Empire fall? It's because Jake started coming back up into power. Okay, that's how the old Roman Empire failed. Jake started coming back up into power, and Jake started ruling, man. Okay, when you go into the Dark Ages, that history, man. Constantine, man. Septimius Severus, and you had the good emperors. Okay, before Septimius Severus, man. You had the good emperors, and they was Jake. They was Jake. Okay, Israelites. Go ahead.
And all the world wondered after the beast.
And all the world wondered after the beast. Okay, go ahead.
Verse 4, and they worshiped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Question. Who is able to make war with him?
So that's America, NATO and the EU, okay, saying who is able to make war against the beast. I tell you, YAHAWASHI, man. He's gonna bring this bitch down, man. You see? And Esau, Edom, in his military might, is gonna be destroyed, man. So you Negro Latinos and Native Americans trust in YAHAWASHI, man. The elect of y'all, the only ones that's gonna turn back. But trust in YAHAWASHI, man. And that's the end of that particular verse.
Thinks it would be a good idea for U.S., Polish, and potentially some Romanian forces to stagger into Western Ukraine. If they do that, we will be at war with Russia. And the real question is, why? Why would we want to go to war with Russia? And I think most people inside the Department of Defense have said, well, we don't. We're not prepared for it. A friend of mine who is in the French Army, or was, he's a retired general now, and said, Doug, the French Army has 4 days of ammunition. The only thing the French Army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. Well, that describes most of the armies in NATO. The question is, how much do we have on hand? We know that our war stocks have been severely depleted in order to supply the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are firing on average 7,000 artillery rounds a day. The Russians are firing 20,000. The Russians are not running out. They're not going to run out. And their industry is fully geared up, and now this mobilization has continued. So, I mean, we're dealing with one side that is unambiguously mobilized and postured to fight, and our side, which isn't. So naturally, people have said this coalition of the willing is a bad idea. This is behind the scenes. And why do we have a coalition of the willing? Because most of NATO is not interested in this. Most of NATO doesn't want to do it. If you go to Spain or Italy or Portugal or Greece, Even France, behind the scenes, people say it's ridiculous. Well, then why do we go along publicly? Well, because people want to be friends with the United States. But we've pushed this to the extreme. And I think at some point people are going to say, well, the hell with Washington. You know, this is not really in our interests. I think we're very close to that. It's unfortunate because this was not what we wanted when we set out.
Right. It's good that you mentioned Milley because during his, I think it was a recent press conference, he stated very adamantly that the United States military, in the shape that it's in, is going to remain number one. Nobody's going to surpass the Americans. Now, a lot of the belief in Poland and NATO vis-a-vis Moscow rests on the assumption that there's no way, having the United States behind us, that anybody can do us any harm. And so having that foundation of your viewpoint, you tend to want to provoke the Russians because you know that Uncle Sam has your back. I think you're very well informed on the state of the United States Armed Forces, and I'd like you to tell the Polish audience, especially listening right now, what can we expect from the American side, if God forbid a shooting war begins?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that we will probably always spend more money than everyone else. Unfortunately, money spent does not equal military capability achieved. And that's not widely understood. Our forces are actually quite small. We have an inexhaustible quantity of generals and admirals, but we have relatively few people who actually fight. And that's a problem. We're having enormous difficulties recruiting for this army that would have to carry the burden in a war with Russia. We can't maintain more than about 475,000 people in the army, and of that number, perhaps 150,000 or 160,000 actually fights. If you tried to mobilize the National Guard or the reserves, you're going to run into a lot of opposition. They've been abused and mismanaged, in my judgment, for the last 22 years of conflict in the Middle East. People are tired, they're worn out, and they're exhausted. But here's something that's much more important than any of this. First of all, neither we nor the Russians want to use nuclear weapons. Obviously, the Russians don't need them. They can accomplish their goals without them. I hope that we are no longer considering any use under any circumstances. The president unwisely signed a document which effectively backed away from our de facto no first use pledge. I think that was a mistake. If we were to resort to the use of nuclear weapons, everything would escalate quickly and civilization as we know it would be extinguished. So that brings us back to the high-end conventional level. What can we do? Well, things have changed since 1945, and your audience needs to understand this. The links between overhead surveillance, space, terrestrial, at sea, whatever, to standoff attack weapon systems that are precise, that have the microcircuitry and the technology to ensure that when you launch, say, a Caliber cruise missile with a large 1,000 kilogram warhead, that you can launch it from Russian territory and it will strike a target in Lisbon, Portugal with great accuracy. And you can launch hundreds, if not thousands of them, all over Europe. If we move to the Atlantic, Russian submarines will end up obstructing the movement of any U.S. forces trying to reinforce our position on the continent. This is not 80 years ago or 85 years ago. This is today. We are limited in what we can do, even if we want to do it, which is why President Trump tried to make the argument that the Europeans must be their own first responders. In other words, if you're betting on our timely arrival, you're making a mistake because it's too easy technologically today for any great power to interfere with the movement of forces and resupply from the United States to Europe. So we can't do what we did in the 1940s, which is essentially spend 2 years defeating the German submarine threat before we finally reached Europe. That won't work. Certainly it's not going to work with the Russians. But again, the Russians know this. They're not...
All right, we're going to face the East. I'd like to give all praises to Yahawah, Bahashem, YAHAWASHI, Bahashem, Rakha Kodash. Double honors to the elder apostle GMS, her rule well. Salute you brothers for pushing this word. And truth, sincerity, strength, by YAHAWASHI. And shalom to you brothers and sisters growing the trust spirit and power YAHAWASHI. Shalom to you too. So with that, Mawafla Babylon.
Mawafla Babylon.
Mawafla Babylon.
Mawafla Babylon.
And Mawafla 2/3 Shalom. Stay strong. Search the scripture. Pray for deliverance.